My name is Thomas Curtis. I retired after 25 years in the Air Force as an aviator. Some people get hooked on drugs. I got hooked on flying. So, pilot training in 1954. First assignment, hometown USA, Ellington Air Force Base, Houston, Texas. Flying a SA-16, a tri-amphibian. You could have landed on the water, you could have landed on the wheels, you could have landed on the skis on the snow. And for someone who had just gone through single engine jet school, this was really a come down. But you try to do the best you can with what you have to work with. And so I flew the SA-16 for a little over a year and finally got checked out as pilot in command, but not as a mission commander because we did search and rescue. At some point, I decided that I wanted to make the Air Force a career, and so I got the book down and I started looking for schools to attend. The first one that I chose was the F-86s. The Century Series airplanes were just coming out, and so the F-100 was in there as well. So I filled out the paperwork, two choices, F-86s, F-100s, set it up, and my command sent the paperwork back and said, you need to list a third choice. Dumb, second lieutenant. I listed a third choice of helicopters because I had been flying in some of our unit helicopters. And about 6 weeks later, I was in San Marcos, Texas, attending rotary wing school on a temporary duty assignment. So H-13, H-19, back to my unit, still flying the SA-16 and the H-19. And then politics came along and eliminated my unit completely. So I moved over to training command, still at Ellington Air Force Base, and flew the navigator training mission and a T-29. And it was a good airplane. It helped my career, got lots of hours quickly. Finally, they were going to get me out of hometown Houston, and so they closed the base to active duty and sent me to California, to Mather Air Force Base, where I continued to fly this mission of T-29, training navigators and bombardiers. I had a lot of time for a young man, and so I became an instructor pilot in the T-29, and I didn't fly the long out over the Pacific Ocean nav training missions, but I would try to teach others how to fly the airplane. So I was settled in for a long tour in California, and the next thing I knew, well, I got orders to go to Germany as a helicopter pilot to a missile wing, of all things. And we had a fellow in my unit that had come from that particular missile wing, and he said they have the little jet that you flew in training, the T-33, and you fly simulated missile missions with that T-33. You train ground controllers. You also qualify them or let them qualify as with you as a missile when they move. And so I went to Germany, Simbach Air Base, and when I got there, they didn't have any helicopters. So I flew the T-33 primarily for the 3 years. We did finally get a couple of H-19s, but then they got some pilots who had flown rotary wing their entire career. So I just sort of folded into the background. Enjoyed the mission of the simulated missile. And then it was 3 years gone, and back to a stateside assignment, and lo and behold, the computer said, you're now going to be a helicopter pilot again. And so that didn't sit well with me, but again, you salute and go do what you're told to do. This time it was a helicopter called the Pedro, the HH-43. It didn't have a tail rotor. It had two counter-rotating blades side by side, but it had a turbine engine, which was just marvelous because I'd always flown an iron engine helicopter, and they couldn't really do a whole lot of work on a hot day. Didn't have enough power. So after a period of time, in 1965, I went to the war in Southeast Asia as a combat search and rescue pilot flying the H-43. In April of that 65, I went to Thailand to a base that we called Nakhon Phanom. It was a Royal Thai Air Base. We had people there who were in a temporary duty status, and I went over for 120 days temporary duty. But unfortunately, the events happened that caused me to spend 2,703 days as a guest of the North Vietnamese. I was shot down in North Vietnam with a 105 pilot in the sling, and after a period of time captured along with two of my crew members, the two airmen, pararescue man, and also the hoist operator, helicopter mechanic. And so that started our long temporary duty. As a POW, I moved different times, moved 13 different times. And it was, we have a description of flying that we use sometimes, and it's called hours and hours of boredom interrupted by moments of stark terror. And so that's the way it was as a prisoner of war. When they were beating on you or twisting on you, it was terror time. Other than that, you were bored out of your skull, trying to get through another day. And first year was in solitary, and then moved in with the fella, in fact, that I was trying to get out of the bushes, in the 105 pilot. So we lived together then for basically 6.5 years and got to know each other quite well. The moves, the organization, we kept our military organization intact. If you were the senior officer in a communication group, you assumed command. And the communication became lifeblood for most of us, because even in solitary, when I learned the TAP code, I was able to communicate with, depending on how many people were on the walls next to me, either 2, 1, 3, or however many. And so time went by, and those moves took place. But an event happened in 1971. I had been at a place called Santé. It was a poor camp, not enough water. And finally, the Vietnamese moved us to another camp not too far away. In November of 71, a group of special forces flown in by Air Force heavy lift helicopters, they raided that camp where we had been. And instead of finding Americans, they found Vietnamese Army. So a firefight ensued, and we knew something had happened just because of all the air activity and the guns that we could hear going off, the missiles, but we didn't know for a period of time. But the next day, the Vietnamese moved us back to Hanoi, and we went into what was called the big rooms. And here, again, still military organization. The senior officer was a Navy lieutenant commander, and then we just kept that military organization intact, and it served us well. At some point, we learned about the Santé raid, and that those 56 special forces flown in by those heavy lift helicopters, and all sorts of diversionary things that happened to confuse the Vietnamese. We enjoyed a much better living situation. For the first time, we have contact with our senior officers. I was a senior captain ready for major when I was shot down. I kept that same rank. I wanted to shoot down, and so we didn't have any problems there about who was going to be the senior ranking officer of the SRO. Moves, again, the Vietnamese were just frustrated with our ability to communicate. And so they took about 200 of us and moved us from the big rooms in Hanoi to a camp that was on the China border. And it was a dismal camp. It was down in a valley and pretty steep sides. And the sun got there late and left early, but at least the torture basically had stopped. Now, you could still get in trouble if you mouthed off, but the ropes and those kinds of things. They had stopped using that. So just again, existing. And our food started to improve, and we were starting to gain some weight. And finally, we were moved from this camp on the China border back to Hanoi, back to the big room, big cells. And for the first time now, we're able to see a face that we knew everything about because we had communicated with them through the wall. And what a joy that was, just to be able to shinny up and look out the bars and see half of the camp out in the morning and the other half out in the afternoon. The Vietnamese told us that there had been an agreement for the exchange of prisoners. And on the 11th of February, I was called out along with others, and we received some real clothes, real shoes with strings in them, and pants with a zipper in them, and shirt with buttons on it. They didn't say you're going home tomorrow, but as it turned out, the next morning, those of us who received clothing were placed on buses, taken through the city of Hanoi, and it was the reaction. Some, you'd get a thumbs up from some, and you'd get a shaking fist or a rock thrown from others. So through town, out to the Geelong airport, we got off the bus as military fighting men. There was no laughing, no funny things going on. We formed ranks and moved up, and when our name was called, we marched forward and saluted and reported for duty to an Air Force colonel that was receiving us. On to an airplane I'd never seen before, a C-141 transport. And we were escorted across the ramp by one of the air crew, found a seat, found magazines, newspapers, Cokes, milk, tea, whatever you wanted. But it was still a very quiet, very somber occasion. And this is so vivid in my memory of the airplane. Finally, the rear ramp was closed. Engine start, taxi into the number one position, throttles up, airplane really ready to fly, and finally the brakes are released. And when we felt the wheels skip and heard the hydraulics raising the gear, it was just absolute bedlam in that airplane. We had been there so many times in our mind, but now it was for real. Things settled down, and then as we got to a point of the water, the pilot called feet wet, and it was another celebration. We were out over the Gulf of Tonkin headed for Clark Air Base in the Philippines. When we got to Clark, the ramp was almost totally full with Americans, school kids. I think every civilian in the Philippines was there to welcome us home. And I kept it together fairly well until we got into the hospital. As I'm walking down the hallway, I can't see much paint because it's covered with welcome home signs made by school kids and pasted on that wall. And so it really became an emotional event for me then. The people who were in charge of Operation Homecoming had been told that they didn't know the condition of what we were in. So they told the food service folk, why don't you prepare a bland diet for these until we find out exactly what's going on. And so my first meal at Clark was breakfast, and my bland diet consisted of steak and eggs and milk and coffee. And so they abandoned the bland diet for most of us. Now, some still had difficulties, but for the most part, we were in decent physical condition. Phone call, talked to my wife, Terry, and got the news from family, about family. And then spent 3 days at Clark, got some uniforms and a good $30 Seiko watch, and I found out about inflation some years later because I needed a crystal for that $30 watch. It cost me $45 just to get the crystal put in. So back, met Terry at the hospital, Air Force Hospital in Keesler, Mississippi, and a joyous reunion there with my two children. When I left, my son was 7. I got home in time for his 15th birthday. So I had left Terry with a lot of responsibility. My daughter had been 4, and she had grown into a beautiful young lady. And so it was then just a time of getting reacquainted after being separated, basically for over 8 years. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it until I'm corrected.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. When you came back, did you have any trouble with any adjustment? Of course you did, but how did that go?
Well, I'm going to go off the script and tell you that the major adjustment I had was it got so that Terry would do a zipper check because I had worn a string thing, and so she'd always make sure my zipper was zipped up. No, I acclimated quickly.
Yeah.
And the Air Force didn't really know if we had any long-term difficulties, and so a lot of us, they allowed to go to Air War College. And so I attended Air War College at Montgomery, Alabama. And after doing okay academically, I needed to find out how can I compete with my contemporaries in an operational unit. I thought I would go back to fixed wing, but as it turned out, I was offered a job with the Air Force Helicopter School as a wing, training wing. And I took the job of Director of Operations and had a lot of folks out there that helped me, kept me out of the weeds and pointed me in the right direction, and I'm eternally grateful to them. And then after a period of time, I knew that I was going to have to either go back overseas or go to a staff job, Major Air Command, the Pentagon. And I didn't want to do that. And so after a lot of soul searching and 25 years, I decided to retire. My intent after retirement had always been to get involved with the Texas education system. And so I got a teaching certificate and taught 1 year junior high, and I discovered that even though I'd been raised on a farm and knew a lot about animals, I didn't fit well with the junior high age. So I went to the high school and used some of the things that I had learned as a prisoner of war. The school I hired to didn't have a foreign language program. So the superintendent who hired me said, "Will you start one?" And so I said, "Yes, sir, but I want to do it current." And so I'm going to go to school at the University of Maryland and Baylor in Belton in the morning. And then I just blew his mind. I said, "If I learn anything, I'll teach that in the afternoon." But it was a good 10 years, and I actually 11 years, I guess it was, total teaching. And no regrets. Enjoyed that, but like so many other things, I couldn't go back to the Air Force again and fly. I couldn't go back to the school system and teach because of just the cultural changes that have taken place. So anyhow, I'm a happy camper. Celebrated my 90th birthday. I asked God for 10 more just so I could find out what it's like to be 100. And so we'll see how that plans out.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your, and you said that your wife had the kids for 8 years. Does she have any thoughts on, being the wife of a person who was a POW?
Well, she got active to a certain extent. She made trips to Washington to plea for information and help. Mm-hmm. And she had had a very strong church family. She stayed she moved to Houston for a year, and then she moved back to a house that we had bought in Louisiana. And there she had really a strong church family. And so, they became our family as well. And unfortunately, when you get to be 90, you look around for some that you've been around before. But that's life. We're going to get out of this world alive, so do the best you can while you're here. Be ready.
I agree. I agree. Did she know where you were? I mean, did she know that you were a prisoner somewhere? Did she at least get that information?
After 18 months, I was declared a prisoner of war. Now, one of the young men, the flight mechanic that I had, hoist operator, he knew about me and he knew about my family. And I guess because he was young, the Vietnamese allowed him and the pararescue men to write to their families.
Okay.
So in the letter that Bill Robinson wrote to his family, he mentioned my father-in-law's nickname, which is very distinctive. He mentioned my children's 2 names. And that mother that got that letter called Terry in Louisiana. She was in North Carolina. And she knew that he was trying to tell that probably I was there and that I was okay. And so that was early on, and then the military finally got around to doing the certification of POW status.
Unbelievable. Did you have any other, stories about, because you said that you wanted to be a pilot and you ended up being with helicopters, which was a totally different realm.
Well, it was, I needed to satisfy myself that I could still compete with my contemporaries. Now, we were promoted along with our contemporaries. So when I was eligible for a major, they promoted me to major. I never put on a major's leaves because I was still a prisoner of war. And so when I was finally released, I had been promoted to lieutenant colonel. And that was a big question, how well can I compete at this grade level? Mm-hmm. But it turned out, people are people, and if you can get them to do the mission, well, then you're successful. And so a lot of folks helped me in that regard.